Hi everybody. Today we're going to start talking about objects. So far we've used data in the form of numbers and strings, true and false values in Boolean variables, but all of them are really single value pieces. Or we've used arrays, which allow you to have a bunch of values, kind of a list of sort of unrelated values, except that they're together under the same array name. Today we're going to start talking about objects. And the idea of an object is to try to represent in data and maybe even methods the kind of properties that real-life objects maybe maintain. A mouse has a certain size, a model name, a maker, how many buttons it has, things like that. A toaster has how many maybe spaces for toast that it has. Maybe a setting on how high or low it should be. It's got a start method, and then when it's done, probably even has a timer in it. And then when it's done, it pops up. So real life objects, we understand have a variety of things to them. A pet has a name and a favorite food and a breed and a birth date. People have most of those things as well. As well as maybe occupations and phone numbers and all of those pieces. So in real life, we understand that a thing has lots of different pieces of information that go with it, sort of intuitively. And we can start to represent that with objects in JavaScript and most programming languages. So let's hop on over into Replit. And what we're going to do is extend that idea of expenses. And we want to think maybe a little bit about what goes into an expense. So it obviously, what we did before was the amount. For instance, maybe $12.95, right? But there are other things that go with it too. Like there's the date of that expense, maybe 5/12/2019. There might be the vendor or the payee, right? So who is it that we're dealing with? Maybe it's Fred Meyer. There might be a description. Buying birthday cake, maybe. Maybe it'll just be birthday cake. That'd make more sense. Right, so if we think about those, really just those four pieces, the amount, the date, the vendor, and the description. And then we start to have maybe an object in place. So one thing that we want to do is maybe create an object, right? So I could say, what I did before was essentially said we had $12.95, $18.12, so that we had a list of the numbers in an array, but that didn't give us the additional information that we'd need to really understand our expenses. So instead, what we're going to do is we use curly braces to start an object, right? And what that allows us to do is then put in our various pieces. So we might say amount is going to be $12.95. Date is going to be 5/20/25/12/2019. I'm going to go ahead and put that in quotes for the sake of simplicity. We'll use that as a string for now. Vendor is going to be Fred Meyer. And the description is going to be birthday cake. Okay? And those become properties of this object. So we can start to process that with the dot notation. And you've used this a ton. Document is an object. So we use document.getElementById. That's a method of the document object. Properties can be referenced in a similar way as well. Alert, new expense, dot. And notice that Replit understands what things are possible. So I can say date plus, we'll put a colon, plus new expense dot amount paid to plus new expense dot vendor. Okay, so I'm just going to run that real quick, and we'll see. It says 5/12/2019, $12.95 paid to Fred Meyer. So that's a pretty good way to start to access the properties of an object, and we can change them as well. New expense dot amount equals $42.85. Alert new expense dot amount. So that's what it said before, and now it equals $42.85. So we can make changes in this same way. And so of course we can take this from our user input as well. Let's take a look at doing that. So I'm going to create a div down here that's going to contain ID equals, and I could do this with a full form, but I'm not submitting it anywhere, so I don't really need a form object. FRM add create expense. Close it off. And I'm going to put an H1, new expense. And we'll do label for equals new date. And it's going to say date. Input type equals date. So this is a separate one that will give you a calendar in most browsers. ID equals new date. I should put that in quotes. And then you can do things with that one to set the default value so that it starts kind of on today. And we might be able to do that right here. I haven't prepped this part, so we'll check and see that, or if we just fail. November 12th, is that today? Looks like it. Pretty good. Okay, so that puts it at today. And then we'll do one for amount. Type equals text. We'll do it as text anyway. We'd need to validate that to make sure it's a number, that it's not less than 0, all that stuff if we're going to be careful, but that's okay. Input type equals text, placeholder equals amount. We need an ID. New amount. And then input type equals text. I could do that as a text area instead of a text field, but I kind of want these to be small. New description. Okay, so if I run that, we'll start to see what this looks like. Not pretty, but it's there, and then I need a button. We'll have it run a function called add expense, and we'll have it say save. I'll have to get rid of those alerts. All right, so I've got those pieces. It's not exactly pretty in here, but it'll do. I can click around and choose different things. Today, that's pretty good. All right. And I can do other things with this, and maybe we'll demonstrate that a little later. And then in add expense, I'm going to come down here and say function add expense var el date for element equals document.get element by ID new date. I think that's what I called it. txt amount. Oh, I didn't put a vendor in there either, but I'll fix that. So I've got each of those pieces. I want to be able to clear it out once I've saved it as well, if it works. Depends a little bit on how I decide to test that, right? So let's go back and add the vendor. And I didn't put labels on those other things either, and it depends on how I want to box this up and all that. New vendor, placeholder vendor, very fancy, très français. We'll reload that guy. That's kind of what it looks like. I definitely want to style up that button at least to make the cursor pointer inset gray. Let's try that. There we go. Let's give that a little padding. Okay, so I can choose, I don't know that it really got a value if I just by default set that at today. That's interesting. I want to clear this stuff out. I'm going to go ahead and alert date. See what it tells me. Of course, I want a capital D. Yeah, doesn't like any of those things. So I don't think that's working the way I want it to, but that's okay. I can still choose it. So now what I want to do is grab the values out of that. New amount equals txt amount dot value. New description equals txt description dot value, and new vendor equals txt vendor dot value, and I need to grab that vendor. Okay, so var new expense equals, we're going to play around with this a little bit, and then we'll drop these objects into an array so we can have more than one. So new equals, oops, I need curly braces, not square brackets. We'll just borrow this stuff so I don't make any mistakes. Amount is going to be, I maybe should parse out that amount so I get a number out of it, but for now I'll just go with new amount, new date, new vendor, and new description. And then right here, I'm going to console.log new expense so that we can see everything that comes up. So I rerun that, and we go today. From Costco, we paid $137.85, and for that we got a new blender. And I save. New date is not defined. I need to check. I'm using that date one and I have not. let's look that up a little bit. HTML date input. Okay. Input type equals date, ID equals start, name equals trip start, value equals, okay. Min to max, so we can put those on there. And then to get out of it, we choose the, should be the value. Date control dot value, date control dot value. So, what did I do wrong? Oops, I need my HTML. ID equals new date. I'm going to get rid of the value equals date. And we'll see what we get here. Add expense line 23. Oh, helps if I make these variables, right? That's that option strict that is saving me from making big mistakes. Obviously, it shouldn't be after today. There we go. So now we have one with an amount of $137.85, a date of 2020-11-12, a vendor of Costco, and a description of Blender. So we now have an object that does that. That's how we start to create objects. And we'll talk a little bit later about those, but if we go var expenses equals empty brackets, then we'll do expenses.push new expense, and then we'll console.log expenses. If we run that, we say yesterday we went to new seasons and we paid $8.25 for basil. Save. Notice now we've got the square brackets and that object in place. And then today we want to clear this out and make that easier for our folks. Today we went to, where did we go today? Home Depot. We spent $299.99 on a chop saw. Notice that now we've got all of this here and all of this here, right? So that gives us some power to control what we do. Notice that it's going to be the same way that it was before with saving it in JSON, with going through and displaying the different pieces, all of those great elements. So let's do some of that. I'm going to get rid of this thing because I don't need it at all. I'm not using it. And I'll get rid of these as well. We don't need those either. Create the new object. And then after I've done this, again, I haven't, we ought to be validating the information. We're not, but we ought to be. Okay. That's the basics. We want to be able to display expenses. So we're going to need a container for that. I'm going to put it up here. Okay. And yeah, that looks okay. I think what we're going to do, I can probably get rid of this one now. Let's call, yeah, display I think is fine. Var display equals document. Get element by ID display. For var, I'm going to do this with the numbered loop. Var I equals 0. I is less than expenses dot length. I plus plus. And then I want to start generating that, and what I picture is a a div that's kind of a box that has the date at the top, the amount maybe beside it, maybe right below for simplicity, the vendor and the description. Maybe I want the vendor at top. It's not very clear. Anyway, var expense equals document dot create element div. We're going to create a div to put it in. Var vendor equals document dot create element h1 vendor dot inner html equals expenses I. That gets us to that element in the array dot vendor. Okay, and I'm going to borrow these because I need all of them, right? I'm going to need the amount, and that's going to be a span. Expenses I dot amount. So we're going to create the new span for that, put it there, and I'm going to put a $sign before it. Obviously, if somebody puts in bad data, I'm in trouble, but I should be checking that. Date is going to be another span. And description is going to be a paragraph, and it gets to be that. Okay, and then I'm going to take expense and I'm going to add in the vendor. I'm going to add in the what do I want next? Date, amount, description. And then I want to take my display and append the expense to it. So if I go here, and I haven't done any, little bit of work to do in display. I want to start by saying display inner HTML equals nothing. That'll clear it out. After I've done my adding an expense, instead of doing a console log, I'm going to pick display. And in window.onload, well, I don't have any local storage yet, so that doesn't matter yet. So the 24th, Costco, $137.85 for a blender. Display is not a function. Display expenses is what that should say. Try it again. Yesterday, to Costco, $137.85 and a blender. Those drop downs are showing up just because of the browser, not because of any work I've done in code. And now it shows this Costco 2020-11-11, $137.85, blender. If I go today, Home Depot, $299.99 for a chop saw. I've got that one as well. Okay, so I can see both of those things. I'm going to go ahead and save these to local storage and retrieve them at the beginning. Function save var JSON expenses equals document equals JSON.stringify expenses. Local storage set item expenses JSON expenses. Alert saved. Okay, so every time I add one, I'm going to save. And then if I want to retrieve, var JSON expenses equals local storage. So I got to get that JSON out of there. Get item expenses. If JSON expenses equals null, then expenses is going to be nothing. Else equals expenses is going to be JSON.parse JSON expenses, and then I display expenses. Okay, so I run this. Yesterday I went to Costco, and for $137.85 I got a blender. And now it says it's saved. Let's take a look at our inspect, our application, local storage, object demo 1. There we go. I have that in my local storage. So let's go ahead and add one more. Today I went to Home Depot. I spent $299.99 on a chop saw. I save. It's saved. This now has 2 elements. And then if I run this again, it doesn't know it. You know why not? Sometimes it's more obvious than others. I don't want to display the expenses there. I need to retrieve. It will display the expenses for me. Reload. There we go. It's got it all. And they show up. So now I can save all of that data. It's still associated correctly, and everything is set. That will be enough to be getting along with. You can notice that this is just inline creating objects. I could create them elsewhere, but I have to redo the code. We'll look at a better way to do it later. But this will get you started. And we can talk about validating that information next time as well. But mess around with this, maybe try to create your own kind of object, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.